The agenda for tonight is main conclusion, main point, and complete the argument questions, all of which are really variations on the same idea, the same theme. And that is simply, what is the conclusion of the argument? What's the main point? Occasionally, they will ask you to complete the argument, but these are all driving at the same general idea here. So these are closely related logical reasoning questions. Variations, main point, what's the main point? What completes the argument? What expresses the conclusion? All pointing to the same general idea here. This is a relatively easier kind of logical reasoning question. But at the same time, it's important to know how to articulate an idea, the main point, the conclusion, and some of the skills that you gain here, even though this is in a logical reasoning context, will still apply to reading comprehension as well. And I'm always talking about find the main idea in reading comp, find the main point there. In logical reasoning, it's typically a little bit easier to do, but it's important. And if you could do it here, then you're much more likely to be able to do it there in a tougher context. So I have this relatively early in the course because it's a simpler introductory kind of question. I think of it as a little bit closer to a gimme than something like parallel reasoning. And I would think of main point or main conclusion as being like an orientation question in logic games, but in the logical reasoning context. Like, you got to be able to do this if you're going to be able to do the tougher stuff. And these aren't always easy, of course. There are tougher versions of it, and we'll get into some examples of that in a few, but you got to start with this to get to the later stuff. So these are, again, some common question stems referring to these kinds of questions. And although complete the argument may be a little bit different because it involves filling in the blank, it's still generally looking for the conclusion as our main conclusion and main point questions. So how do I do these? You've got those key words and phrases: main conclusion, main point, logically completes, and you're looking for evidence and conclusion indicator words. They won't always appear. You might have only evidence indicators or only conclusion indicators or neither. And obviously, the fewer indicators you have, the tougher it's going to be. But it's worth slowing down, taking a moment to figure out the logical relationship between the two parts. Which part supports the other part? And overall, you're looking for that general main point, the main idea, the reason the author went about making this argument in the first place. Now, the drills. This is really what I have in mind for us to cover tonight, is simply a bunch of drills. So this is obviously a very simple, easy drill. Steve didn't go to law school because he got too obsessed with the LSAT. Simple argument here. There's an evidence indicator, but no conclusion indicator. What's the conclusion of this argument? Anybody want to unmute yourselves and just share?
Steve didn't go to law school.
Perfect. And what's the indicator word we have here?
I don't think there is an indicator word, right?
Is it because?
Yeah, perfect. So because is the indicator giving us evidence. So whatever immediately follows that evidence indicator, because, is going to be our evidence. And then whatever's left is going to be the conclusion. So simple example. It obviously gets tougher than that. Let's look at another one here. The reason people's allergies worsen when they move to Cincinnati is that the pollen count in Cincinnati is higher than almost anywhere else in the surrounding area. So not really a whole lot of clear indicator words here. Obviously a longer argument, a longer stimulus as well. Can anyone tell me what a potential indicator phrase might be for this one?
Reason.
Excellent, nice. So the reason X happens is that. So everything, the reason people's allergies worsen when they move to Cincinnati, that you could cut all of that out and just say, the reason is that the pollen count in Cincinnati is higher than almost anywhere else. So the reason is that blah, blah, blah is telling us why people's allergies worsen. So what's the overall conclusion here?
Anyone can unmute to answer, or?
Yeah, anybody, yeah, feel free.
Okay. The pollen count in Cincinnati is higher than almost anywhere else in the surrounding area.
So the pollen count being higher tells us what? What is that? Does that support something else, or is that supported by something else?
I think it supports that people's allergies worsen when they move to Cincinnati.
Perfect. Nice. You got it. So the reason people's allergies worsen, that's the conclusion. And then what follows is telling us why their allergies worsen. The pollen count being higher is our support. It's the explanation for why the allergies worsen. So that first part is conclusion. The second part is evidence giving us the background reasons why. Nice. Let's do another one here. Fracking should be allowed because although it does involve some environmental risk, it reduces our dependence on foreign oil, and there is much greater harm to the environment due to foreign oil drilling than there is to fracking. So what's the conclusion here?
That fracking should be allowed.
Perfect. Awesome. Fracking should be allowed. And why do you say that's the conclusion, Jasmine?
Well, first of all, there's also the because, which is an indicator word, and everything following that is evidence to support why fracking should be allowed.
Perfect. And if you could cut out one part of this stimulus that wasn't central to the argument, that was neither evidence nor conclusion, what would that be?
I don't know, maybe like all of like the stuff below that says there's a much greater risk of harm, all of that other stuff.
So we got a couple of pieces of evidence here, right? We have the word because indicating evidence. And before we get to the actual evidence, we have this part bounded by 2 commas.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So if we cut that out and we say fracking should be allowed because why? Number 1, reduces dependence on foreign oil. 2, much greater harm to the environment due to foreign oil drilling than fracking. So 2 different pieces of evidence that together guarantee the conclusion fracking should be allowed. So that part between the commas is not the direct part that should follow the because. It's really a parenthetical statement. And what role is this phrase here playing?
It's a filler.
Yeah, it's a filler. It's a filler. And what else is it doing?
Does it describe?
Yeah, it's describing, it's giving some background. It's a counter premise. It's acknowledging a weakness of the argument in favor of fracking. So this argument is somewhat balanced. You may not agree with the conclusion, but it's pointing out a potential problem with fracking, that there is environmental risk. They're saying, despite the risks, there are some pros that outweigh the cons. So this is like what you would want to do on the LSAT writing sample. You want to give a well-reasoned argument that acknowledges the pros and cons of the side that you choose. This is not a super extreme argument saying fracking is the best thing ever. There are no downsides at all. They're saying there's a potential problem with it, but they're dismissing that problem in favor of the 2 pieces of evidence stated: reduces dependence on foreign oil and greater harm due to foreign oil drilling than due to fracking. So this part bounded between 2 commas, you could chop that out and the argument would still flow pretty smoothly. And yeah, I do think, Fabiola, that this is trying to trick us or distract us in some way. Anytime you have filler that's not core to the argument, it's cluttering things up. And overall, a counter premise, is it really entirely filler? I couldn't say that it serves no role at all. It's there for, it plays a role in the argument, but if you want to boil the argument down to its core, simply evidence conclusion, then that statement I called parenthetical kind of gets in the way. And so I would chop that out maybe. I would, if it were on the paper LSAT, I would cross it out with a pen. Otherwise, maybe you want to highlight it in some way. Obviously, on the digital LSAT and the Flex, highlighting can actually emphasize something unless you train yourself to use it for a different purpose. Luckily, the program I'm using right now kind of downplays or de-emphasizes that particular phrase, and we can jump to what we really want to focus on. But chopping out information that you don't want to focus on can be really useful to help you really just get down to what matters here. So conclusion, fracking should be allowed. Evidence, reduces dependence on the oil, and there's greater harm to the oil due to the oil than due to fracking. So conclusion is what's immediately before the word because. Let's look at another one here. No one living in Pompeii could have survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The reason is simple. The lava was flowing too fast and there was nowhere to go to escape it in time. Therefore, this account of the eruption, which claims to have been written by an eyewitness living in Pompeii, was not actually written by an eyewitness. What's the overall conclusion here?
It's the no one living in Pompeii could have survived the corruption of Mount Vesuvius, even though maybe you could say there is a word therefore. So the conclusion might come after that, but it doesn't. The information given does not really encompasses everything that the author talks about, I think.
That's a good point there. So you pointed out a conclusion, the first sentence, but then you acknowledged that the word therefore kind of raises a question as to, is there more than one conclusion and which one is the true main conclusion? So there's some complexity here. This is definitely a tougher argument than the ones we've previously looked at. Anybody else want to share their thoughts on this one?
That it was not actually written by an eyewitness.
Nice. And Jasmine also points out in the chat, she thinks there's more than one conclusion. Yeah, so anybody else want to share thoughts as to which one it is?
I think it's just one conclusion, and I'll have to agree that was not actually written by an eyewitness.
Nice, excellent. So it is, in fact, that final sentence. Therefore, this account of the eruption claimed to be written by an eyewitness was not actually written by an eyewitness. So conclusion, it was not written by an eyewitness. And we don't even get to the fact that there is a particular account in question here or the eyewitness till the final sentence. So this particular paragraph as a whole there's a larger context that we're not being given here. So this would actually be an example that's maybe better for reading comp than for logical reasoning, but I threw it in anyway because it's a complex argument. We've got primary evidence, sub-conclusion, then main conclusion being the final sentence. So they're under no obligation to give us things in any particular order. This is, again, sub-conclusion first, then evidence, then main conclusion. No one living could have survived because the lava was flowing too fast. You couldn't escape it in time. So for that reason, overall, this account of the eruption, which is claimed to be by an eyewitness, could not possibly have been written by one because they probably would not have survived the eruption if they'd been around to see it. We've got Jasmine sharing here in the chat, no one living in Pompeii could survive, therefore, claims were not written by an eyewitness. Perfect, exactly. So second sentence, then first sentence, then final sentence is the order I would go for evidence, sub-conclusion, main conclusion. Each part subsequently supports the following parts.
Steve, just for further clarification, you have to take everything for certain in this, or you have to take everything as true in the stimulus. So assuming here would land you into trouble that there can be multiple conclusions. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, so for a main conclusion question, our job is not to challenge anything here in the stimulus. We're not problematizing this argument or looking for gaps or looking for flaws. That's not our task here. For anything that's an inference kind of question, or we're simply describing something here, we're not looking to poke holes in this. So I would take everything here as given. And each part is supporting another part. Like I said, are there potential gaps here in some way? Maybe. I don't see this as being fundamentally flawed, but even if I did, that's not the task that we have to do here. Our job is simply to recognize there's a sub-conclusion, there's evidence, and there's a main conclusion, and to recognize that that first sentence is actually supporting the final sentence. Because nobody could have survived, then eyewitness accounts couldn't actually exist, period. That's really what they're getting at here. Does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Nice. All right, let's look at another one here. Another drill. Albert and Caroline like to go for runs in the afternoon in Hyde Park. Since Albert never runs alone, we know that anytime Albert is running, Caroline is running too. But since Albert looks like he has just run, since he is panting hard, it follows that Caroline must have ran too. So this one doesn't have a ton of obvious indicators, but it does have a few. What's our conclusion indicator here?
Albert and Caroline like to go for runs, because wouldn't anything coming after 4 would be evidence?
Interesting. Okay, yeah, so the word for can be an evidence indicator. Is that what it's doing here, though?
No, as I was saying that, I realized that that's not the case.
Yeah, so the word for could be an evidence indicator, but here it's just clarifying what they like to go do.
Is the conclusion that Albert and Caroline always run together? Because it looks like it has like a conditional logic where since Albert went for a run and because he was panting hard, and then Caroline must have ran too. So does that mean that Caroline and Albert always run together?
So you mean this part, like the second sentence? Because we have since here, and then we know that. Is that what the second sentence, what you're referring to here?
Oh yeah, maybe I was just focusing on that then, not the conclusion.
Okay, so yeah, that's definitely, we have since is an evidence indicator. So since Albert never runs alone, we know that anytime Albert's running, Caroline's running too. And that's given. That's a given, like a general principle, because it's describing things in the abstract, what happens in general. But then we also have this specific application of that rule. Like the second sentence is a rule that we then have the application of in that final sentence.
Okay.
We have the particular case. So I'd say that this second sentence is supporting that final sentence. And they both have that since X, therefore Y format, but the general is supporting the specific. So we have a couple of folks in the chat who shared thoughts. We have Maggie saying Caroline must have ran too, meaning that final clause. We have Jasmine talking about Albert running, therefore Caroline must be too. But that, I'm not sure if that's referring to either the second or the third sentence. And then we have some folks agreeing that it's the final part. And yes, since is an evidence word. Since is a premise indicator word here, Fabiola. Yeah, so overall, it is that final sentence. That final sentence is the main conclusion here. It's the main conclusion supported by the general principle in the second sentence. The first sentence, I would say, is more like background. It's filler. Do we care that they like to run, that they enjoy doing it? Not necessarily. Do we care where they do it? That it's in Hyde Park specifically? Again, not necessarily. Does it matter that it's in the afternoon? Not really. It's just basically that Albert doesn't go alone, and therefore, for that reason, we apparently assume that Albert's only friend for running is Caroline. There's nobody else Albert's ever going to run with. That's given, and then they're saying it follows that. It follows that is a conclusion indicator. Since Albert has just run, or it looks like he's just run, then Caroline must have ran too. And to go back to the question of, can we problematize this? Can we point out gaps or flaws? Like Albert looks like he's just run since he's panting hard. Well, could he be panting hard for some other reason? Maybe he just climbed the stairs carrying a bunch of groceries. Maybe he's out of shape and has a difficult time exerting himself. Could be a number of reasons why he looks like he's just run, even if he hasn't. Maybe he was doing something else and Caroline wasn't running, period. So we can expose gaps or potential flaws here, but that's not the job for a main conclusion question or main point. Our job is simply to articulate or identify what the main point is, which I would say is that final clause. All right, let's go to the next one here. Again, this one I'm going to call main point, even though main point, main conclusion, pretty much the same thing. I wouldn't say there's any significant difference between the two, really. So I'll read it and we'll talk about it. Just because Jeremy's prints were on the gun that killed Tim and the gun was registered to Jeremy, it doesn't follow that Jeremy killed Tim, since Jeremy's prints would certainly be on his own gun and somebody else could have stolen Jeremy's gun and used it to kill Tim. So that's a big run-on sentence here, and not unlike what you might see in reading comp in particular. Let's break it down a little bit. What's the conclusion? Can we find the conclusion to start with? Are there any indicator words?
It doesn't follow.
Nice, excellent. So we talked previously, it does follow that, or it follows that being conclusion. It doesn't follow that would also be a conclusion indicator. And I see Mike wrote that in the chat as well, and Fabiola agreed. So perfect. Yeah, so that's a conclusion indicator. What's an evidence indicator?
Since Jeremy's prints.
Good. So since Jeremy's prints, the word since there is an evidence indicator. Nice. And what's this because doing here? What role does that play? Because sounds like an evidence indicator, right? So this one's a little bit trickier. So they're saying just because, and that just adds some kind of context in the form of tone that tells us because might be evidence, but just because means that alone shouldn't necessarily tell us something else. So we've got a lot of circumstantial evidence here is what they're saying basically. Just because the prints were on the gun and the gun was registered to Jeremy, that alone doesn't give us enough reason to think Jeremy killed Tim. So they're actually de-emphasizing that first clause. They're saying this is counter premise. They are explaining, as you're saying, Rosetta, they are explaining, but they're downplaying that and saying, just because it was that stuff is the case, we can't automatically assume Jeremy killed Tim. And then that final since is telling us why that information in the first clause, in that counter premise alone isn't enough to guarantee Jeremy killed Tim. So first sentence is counter premise, everything in the first two lines, counter premise. Background that we are then dismissing and saying, isn't that big a deal? Then the third line, it doesn't follow that Jeremy killed Tim, is the main point or the main conclusion. And then the since in line 4 is indicating the primary or really the only evidence supporting the main conclusion. The first statement was counter premise, evidence that goes against the conclusion that we're ultimately downplaying or even dismissing. So as Maggie wrote, Jeremy killed Tim is the main conclusion. And it doesn't follow that is the indicator word, the indicator phrase, supporting or indicating that conclusion. Tough one. Any questions on this one? All right, let's go to the next. There was somebody in this cabin recently because there was warm water in the tea kettle and because there was wood still smoldering in the fireplace. But the person couldn't have been Tim because Tim has been with me the whole time. Therefore, there must be someone else in these woods. So what's our main conclusion? Anybody have an idea?
There must be someone else.
Nice, nice, excellent. So indicated by therefore. So final sentence is the conclusion, indicated by therefore. What's our evidence? Jasmine saying there must be someone else in these woods, and Fabiola said there was someone in this cabin recently. Nice, yeah, so someone in the cabin recently is giving us some background, and it appears to be somewhat of a repetition of that final sentence, just in a slightly different format. But someone being in the cabin supports the idea that there's someone else in the woods. So they're related, but if I had to say, I would say that that final sentence is the main conclusion supported by the evidence about the cabin, assuming that the cabin is actually in the woods. Ayana and Nina are talking about the warm water, the smoldering fire. Those are both pieces of evidence telling us there was someone in the cabin recently. Then the stuff about Tim in particular, it's dismissing Tim as being the person in question, opening us up to there being somebody else. So I'd say this sentence about Tim is dismissing the idea that it could be Tim, and then someone else being in the cabin, someone being in the cabin recently tells us there's somebody in the woods, period. If that person is not Tim, then together, somebody else. I see Carney writing in the chat, there couldn't have been someone with me the whole time, so someone else must have been Tim. Carney, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, what I meant was since the person couldn't have been Tim because he was with the speaker the whole time, there must have been someone else in the woods. I felt like they inferred that there must be someone else because it couldn't have been neither the speaker nor Tim.
Yeah. Combined with the first sentence.
Mhm.
Yeah, together. So someone in the cabin recently, we know it wasn't Tim because Tim was with me. Therefore, there's somebody else altogether, and that the warm water, the wood in the fireplace together are telling us there was somebody there. So I'd say it's multi-layer building up. So the warm water and wood in the fireplace, I'd say those are the primary evidence.
Mhm.
Then the someone in the cabin combined with the information about Tim together are then leading us to that final sentence, somebody else in the woods, again, being broader than just the cabin. We've got hockey players. I'll read it out. Since all professional hockey players are missing front teeth and Martin is a professional hockey player, it follows that Martin is missing front teeth. And since almost all professional athletes who are missing their front teeth have false teeth, it follows that Martin probably has false teeth. What's the conclusion here?
Martin probably has false teeth.
Yeah, perfect. You all got it. Yeah, I see a couple folks in the chat wrote that as well. Yeah, so it just builds and builds and builds bit by bit. And each part is following the subsequent part. So that one's really not too bad, I'd say. You all got it. So complete the argument is a type where you typically have something that's left open-ended that hasn't yet been filled in, and it's your job to fill it in. And it could be conclusion, could be evidence, but more often it's conclusion that you're looking to fill in. So some people on Earth are aliens in disguise. This is a fact that was unearthed by the CIA in 1947 at Roswell and carefully covered up. John, your reclusive neighbor, has a fascination with UFOs, secretively tinkers with machines in his garage, and allegedly abducted a cow once. Therefore, John blank.
Is an alien.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is the most likely conclusion based on everything above. Is it guaranteed 100%? No, but it's what they're building up to. So this could be fill in the blank. This could also be a most strongly supported question, something that's incredibly likely to be the case, maybe not 100% guaranteed, but a reasonable assumption that you could make. So that's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. It's just what the evidence is leading us to what we're building up to. Nice. Anyone have questions on this one? LSAT is not going to write anything like this, I guarantee you. All right, and the next and last. Everyone who lives on Earth lives in the solar system. Everyone who lives in the solar system lives in the Milky Way galaxy. Therefore, everyone who lives on Earth, blank. What's the most likely conclusion based on all of this?
Everyone who lives in the Milky Way galaxy?
Yeah, everyone who lives on Earth lives in the Milky Way galaxy. Perfect. And I see a couple of folks in the chat got it as well. Awesome. Yeah, so this is actually straightforward formal logic. You can build the transitive property, and you could even diagram this if you wanted to. Earth, arrow, solar system, arrow, Milky Way galaxy, therefore Earth, arrow, Milky Way galaxy. It's what they're driving towards, the most likely conclusion, and in this case, it would be guaranteed logically by the evidence, since this is more formal logic related, not informal reasoning. So yeah, you all got it. Great. So that's generally what these kinds of questions are like. Main conclusion, main point, fill in the blank, complete the argument. This is pretty much what they're like. We had some easy examples, some hard examples. This is generally, like I said, one of the easier logical reasoning question types. Tougher ones do come up though. And so in future classes, we'll get into some other logical reasoning types out there. In particular, I've noted sufficient assumption as being a good area to focus on, like we talked about yesterday in the group coaching, the mastermind. So I'll have that on the agenda in a few weeks. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.